Three Religious Rebels, Chapter 10. This chapter is entitled, There is Only One Way. Robert's prayer was heard, but in the strangest of fashions. While the old man gave himself recklessly to penance and prayer at Howard, unusual events took place at Molem. The serfs near the monastery began to learn that all was not right with the community. Bit by bit they gathered the facts. Soon, from field to stable, from stable to kitchen, from kitchen to the parlor and the lady of the mansion, the word of the quarrel reached the nobles. Indignation at the treatment of the prior and abbot filled the countryside. From then on, Molem was avoided like a haunted house, and her monks were shunned as lepers. Before a year had passed, this ostracization showed its effects on the monastery's treasury. All donations stopped, and many of the serfs refused to work at the abbey. Soon, actual poverty was being felt. As meals grew thinner and isolation more absolute, even the most stubborn showed signs of yielding. Finally, it was unanimously agreed that they must beg their abbot to return. The delegation appointed to wait on him found the old man at prayer. Very humbly they begged, but Robert met their request curtly. You don't want my ideals, you want my popularity. You do not beg for my interpretation of the rule, but only for the donations you once received from the rich. This reply was more of a blow to the community than Robert's original withdrawal. What were they to do? Romanus gave a solution. If Robert would not listen to petitions from those under him, he would always obey commands from his superiors. They must obtain a mandate from Rome. But, he warned them, you will have to pay for that mandate. It may cost complete capitulation to Robert's wishes. It most certainly will cost concessions. There was no dissent. They preferred strict observance to social disapproval. All were ready to capitulate if there were no other way. 2 of their number hastened to the Eternal City. Through influential friends, they won an early audience with His Holiness, Urban II. He listened to their story, and when he learned how ready they were to obey, he granted them the desired mandate. 2 happy monks hurried from Rome to Molem, but happier ones hurried from Molem to Howard. Robert read the mandate in silence. Without a word to the messengers, he turned, closed the door of his little hut, bade farewell to the 3 solitaries, then said, "Let us go home." The veterans of Colan and early Molem welcomed their old abbot with warm affection, some even with tears. The dissenters were very subdued, some sheepish. Life at the abbey soon struck its old tempo. Robert was diplomat enough to make some concessions to the recalcitrants, thus winning them to readier obedience on his more essential reforms. Alberic did not like the concessions, but Stephen Harding reminded him that the breaking of a minor custom was much more bearable than the breaking of a head. With a self-conscious smile and a nod, Alberic conceded the point. But promises are always more easily made than fulfilled. It is true that Molem flourished as of old. Postulants came in greater numbers, more abbots asked for men to introduce Molem customs into their communities. Serfs once more worked on the granges. The benefactors became even more generous. But before many years had passed, Alberic was pointing out that it was not the spirit of Colan that fired the community, and Stephen Harding was admitting that it was not the spirit of early Molem. No individual could be blamed, but the intangible atmosphere was saturated with antagonism to anything that was not in accord with the great Cluny and the almost universal custom of the monastic world. Even old Robert grew discouraged. One day, Alberic asked Stephen Harding what he thought of the peace at Molem. The Englishman looked at him. This is not peace, Alberic. This is truce. We will never have perfect peace at Malem. Never? Alberic was surprised at the tinge of bitterness that edged Stephen's words. He knew the Englishman for a conservative, far-seeing, mild-spoken man. Well, what's your solution? He asked. There's only one way out, Alberic, which is, prompted the prior, which is to quit this place and found a new monastery. What? Yes, and in that monastery we must be more radical than Robert has yet been. We must go back to the very letter of the rule, stripping away everything that smacks of Cluny or contemporary custom. In other words, we must be complete in our rebellion. And I thought the English were temperate, exclaimed Albert. Stephen smiled. It is the only way. Mark my words. This truce cannot last forever. Either the abbot will have to compromise or the community will have to capitulate, and I don't think either will ever do either. They are asking dispensations again. I know, said Alberic slowly. The abbot feels it keenly. Indeed, the abbot felt it keenly. Late one afternoon, when the day was all red and gold, he sat in his room thinking these same sad thoughts and shaking his aged head in an agony of grief. For 65 years, the call to a fuller living of the rule had sounded in his ears incessantly, as the wash of some weariless sea. Why could he not get others to hear the same? Why was it that he could not make heroic monks out of ordinary men? Why? This was the 80th year of his life, and the 65th of his religious service. And what had he to show? He had been unable to revolutionize so much as a single monastery. Indeed, he had failed utterly. Men would not catch and hold the spark. The old man shook a sad head and suddenly realized he was tired. Things about him looked barren and black. His white head sank into his aged hands. Suddenly there came a knock at his door. He was tempted not to answer that knock. So weary, futile, and defeated did he feel. But the discipline of the years won, and he gave the signal to enter. Unknowingly, he had answered a knock that was to reverberate for centuries. It was a knock that would open the gates of Malem and establish a new order of things in all Europe. It was the knock of Alberic and Stephen Harding. The old man was relieved when he saw them. They would have no complaints. He was grateful on that account. Why have they come together, he wondered. He had not long to wonder, for Alberic, in his usual direct fashion, told him that they, too, had seen silver white on flaming red, that they, too, had seen the evening star, that they, too, would be gallant to God. Indeed, Alberic and Stephen had caught the spark. They were ready for real rebellion. They did not want to reform Malem. That, Stephen pointed out, was not feasible, nor was it compatible with their ideals. They did not want to do away with the dispensations and mitigations that had crept into their present monastery. No, they wanted to do away with all mitigations. They wanted the rule, the whole rule and nothing but the rule. They wanted it as naked as Benedict had written it, as chaste as Monte Cassino had lived it. They wanted to be what Christ had called them to be, penitents for an unrepentant world. Robert dreamed dreams. He was 16 years old again. He was back at St. Pierre de la Selle. He was young, eager, brave, and undisillusioned. And yet he was not dreaming. It was true. His ideal had caught. Men held the spark. His rebellion could be waged. These men would not only be generous, but even be gallant to God. Reverend Father, begged Alberic, may we have your permission to leave Malem and found a new monastery? Robert knew he must speak. These two were waiting for an answer. He breathed deeply. No, he said. No, you may not go. You may not carry out this mad plan of yours. You may never do this rebellious thing unless... Robert stopped. Stephen and Alberic stood amazed at his utterly unexpected reply. "Unless," Robert went on, "unless I am at your head." Robert of Molem had become Robert of St. Pierre. An old man of 80 had become a boy again. He stretched out 2 trembling hands toward Alberic and Stephen and said, "Accept an old man's thanks." His voice was rich with emotion as he cried, "Brothers in Christ, let us do this thing together." Robert was ready to quit his abbey. He had his men. He had his plans. He had his ideals. He was convinced that only thus could peace be obtained for those left and those who remained. His heart was singing as he went about his final preparations for departure. Suddenly the song failed. Stephen Harding found him sitting despondent at his desk. In response to Stephen's anxious questions, Robert threw out his hands in a gesture of helpless resignation. "Obedience shackles me," was all the old man could say. He had suddenly remembered that Rome had commanded him to return to Molem. Rome alone could free him. He could never leave on his own authority. Stephen was taken aback. He too had a passionate loyalty to the Holy See. It seemed that he must either go without his abbot or remain without his reform. Neither alternative appealed to him. As they looked at one another sadly, Alberic entered in boisterous spirits. "Well, well, well," he exclaimed. "Who snuffed out the sun? You two look as glum as Noah must have looked on the day his dove didn't come back. What's the matter?" They told him briefly. Without a moment's hesitation, he blurted, "Well, what's wrong with getting the Pope's command? If Romanus and his clique could get a mandate, I judge we can get something as good." "But the time it will take," objected Stephen. "No time at all," interrupted Alberic. "The papal legate is in Lyon. He can give the release Reverend Father needs, and at the same time we can get papal approbation for our undertaking. Think what that will mean." Stephen and Robert exchanged glances. Smiles broke out. Alberic had shown them the way. Not many days later, 7 men stood before Hugh, Archbishop of Lyon and Legate of the Holy See. He listened to them quietly. Soon he had all the facts before him. Contention arising from conflicting ideals. Determined parties on each side. No peace. All the while he had been studying the group of men before him. He marveled at the light that flamed in their eyes. It told of strong fires in their hearts. Their reasoning was logical. Since compromise was impossible, contention was inevitable. Their request, then, to be allowed to found a new monastery was reasonable. Hugh ran his eyes from man to man, recalling each one's name. This was Alberic. Nice smile the man had. Next was Odo, a veritable mountain of a monk. Fasting hadn't hurt him. This was John, tall, thin, gaunt, with a camel's hair tunic he could pass for the Baptist. Next, a quiet man, studious, cultured. Oh yes, Stephen Harding, the Englishman. The next 2 were French all right, and fiery French. They had been on edge all during the interview. Letaldus and Peter they were called, and at their head was this old man of 80, Robert. He had as much youth as the youngest and more fire. Hugh cleared his throat. He told the men before him that he sympathized with them. Peace was an essential in every monastery. He appreciated their predicament, but they must appreciate his. To countermand a papal mandate was no light matter. It called for careful consideration. However, he added, it has been done before and it can be done, especially when the glory of God and the salvation of souls is at stake. Then he smiled. "My fathers," he said, "may I offer you my sincerest congratulations on your zeal. You can be sure that I shall weigh the matter, and if at all possible, will give papal approbation. You may expect final word within a few days." They left, and on the way home there was much talk. Rune said his last speech was just policy to put them off. Others were even less sanguine. They feared that he would not countermand the mandate. Robert was silent for the most part. He simply said, "We must pray that God's will be done." 2 days later, the document came. Alberic was in the abbot's room when he unrolled it. The joy in the old man's face prepared him for the excited cry. "Listen to this, Alberic, listen to this. Therefore, consulting the salvation of both parties in the said monastery, Malem, we have thought it better that you should retire to some place which God in his bounty may point out to you, therein to serve him with greater health and quietness of soul. And we confirm this our advice to you, to persevere in your holy design by our apostolic authority and seal." Apostolic authority and seal! We can go, Alberic! We can go! Robert did not wait the day out. He summoned the entire community to a special chapter. "Men of Malem," he declared, "I am no longer your abbot. You are no longer my monks. With papal permission and approbation, I leave your midst tomorrow or the next day. I cease being your leader this moment. Elect my successor when you will, but I do not go alone. All who wish to be gallant to God, to give more than others give, to empty themselves as Christ emptied himself, to stand in the gap before the wrath of omnipotence for the sake of the land, all who wish to live the rule they have vowed to live, and live it to the letter, may come with me. Such is the will of the Holy See." He then read them the document from the papal legate. A silence that could almost be heard filled the room. The men sat as if cut from stone. Then Robert said, "All who wish to follow, step forward." Here, there, and further down, men leapt from their seats and took their stand in the corner in the center of the room. Robert counted those who were standing. "God," he cried, "I have 20 to follow me. Christ only had 12. His last action was characteristic of him. He begged pardon for all the faults he had committed while abbot, asked the continued prayers of all who remained behind, and gave them his most solemn blessing. It was 1098, the year all Europe shook to the tread of marching feet as men, women, and even children set off for the first crusade. "God wills it! God wills it!" was the rallying cry, and the marching song that buoyed up and carried on knighthood's most chivalrous members. But "God wills it" rang in no one's soul more exultingly than in the soul of an old man of 80 as he walked the snow-covered roads of France at the head of a band of 20 monks. Robert felt more knightly than did Godfrey of Bouillon. They did not make a very impressive group, these men who trudged on the road from Malem to Chalon. They had vestments for mass, a large book for the office, and very little else. And yet this was the group that gave the world a revolution. They stopped at a wood called Citeaux, still in the Duchy of Burgundy. Citeaux, what a place! A more unlikely spot for human habitation could hardly have been found. It was a swampy wood, dark with the growth of overlapping trees and damp with the ugly damp of many stagnant pools. 23 years before, Robert had left Cologne because it was unhealthy. Now he plunged into this swampland with zest. Alberic wondered if his abbot thought there was some proportion between effects and efforts, between sanctity and struggle, between divinizations and difficulties. If so, he told himself, then Robert certainly wanted the highest of high sanctity for his little band of 20, and nothing short of actual divination for Citeaux, for Citeaux spelled difficulty and fiercest struggle. It was midwinter. Trees were bare. Marshy pools were dirty even in their ice. All was bleak, lonely, desolate, death-like. This was the Citeaux that Robert and his band looked at in the snows of 1098. And into that repulsive woodland they plunged. Work began immediately. Down came trees, up came briars and brambles. Some fires of waste shone through the trees as 21 men bent to the task of clearing a land for habitation. Hardly 2 weeks later, Odo, Duke of Burgundy, was riding along the snow-covered road that swept past Citeaux. He was thinking of his earlier days, none too pleasant thoughts. He had been a robber baron, one of those iron-hearted, iron-handed men who made life miserable for pilgrim, peasant, and even prince. There had been excitement to the life, admitted Odo, a certain zest in every capture. But as he rode along, he saw before him the face of his last captive. It was St. Anselm. He smiled at the irony of what had happened. Odo had planned to take everything Anselm had. He was just about to do it when the saint had turned the tables and took not only everything Odo had, but even Odo himself. He took him from a life of thievery and made him a God-fearing duke. Odo came out of his reverie with a laugh. He slapped his horse and shouted with joy and relief. But it was not the echo of his shout that came back to him from the wood. No, it was something distinctly different. He turned his horse to the trees. Slowly he picked his way toward that noise. It came to him dearer and clearer. Odo frowned. This woodland had always been deserted. What could such activity mean? He approached more cautiously. Finally, he discovered figures moving about the rough trees. He watched. They were monks. They were building. He came closer. Calling one of them, he asked who they were and what they were building. When he learned they were from Molem and that this was a new monastery they were erecting, his hands went up. He cried, That? A monastery? Where's your abbot?" Robert came and introduced himself. Odo bowed, then almost barked. "Reverend Father, before nightfall, a whole troop of real workmen will be here. Let them put up something fit for a man." When Robert tried to thank him, Odo laughed. "The shoe goes on the other foot, Reverend Father. You've heard of restitution, haven't you? Well, I have a lot to make. You are helping me make it." He rode away, and before nightfall, a whole troop of men came into the woodland, and Citeaux teemed with activity. So rapidly did they work that on March 21st, the new monastery, as it was called, was solemnly inaugurated. Alberic was jubilant. He burst in on his abbot after the ceremony and cried, "Do you know what day this is? I don't want to be superstitious, but think of it, Reverend Father. Today is March 21st, St. Benedict's feast day, and it falls on Palm Sunday. You've made your triumphal entry into your city of God on the feast day of the man whose rule you are going to observe to the letter. That's no accident, that's divine providence. We have begun well." "Pray that we continue well," advised the abbot. "Well begun is more than half done," returned the prior with a smile, and was gone. 16 months later, while Citeaux sweltered under a July sun, another solemn ceremony took place. It was the dedication of the very substantial church of the new monastery. Odo had helped with men, money, and materials. But Robert and his 20 were far from idle. There was too much fire in their souls to allow them simply to supervise. They worked, and Citeaux, birthplace of a new chivalry, came into being.